Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Amaia Iratzoqui. I am a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Most of my students call me Dr. I, so if you've ever taken a class in our department or you've heard good or bad things about Dr. I, that would be me. My area of specialization in terms of my research and my teaching is anything within the realm of gender, as well as the intersectionality of gender and race when it comes to gendered forms of violence. And so for the most part, that leads me to focus on domestic and family forms of violence. And so most of my research deals with those areas, as well as the classes that I teach for the university. I have taught classes on Introduction to Criminal Justice. I have taught criminology theory, as well as our race and gender course, my own developed intimate partner violence course, which is also offered as a graduate class. And then I also teach graduate classes for our department related to the required courses, including graduate research methods. So I tend to teach a wide variety of topics, but in all of my classes, I tend to include themes from my research, predominantly in terms of the impact that it has on Memphis and Shelby County. Most of what I do here is involved with work in the courts as well as the police department. I predominantly work with the Memphis Police Department as well as Shelby County Sheriff. And then I do most of my work, the area which I'm probably most passionate with social service agencies here, whether that be the Exchange Club or as it's formerly known, the Kindred Place, Family Safety Center, the YWCA, Casa Luz, the Hispanic serving agency here in Memphis, and then a number of other agencies as well, and to be able to do research to best serve our community, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. And so that's kind of what I've done in the, believe it or not, 6 years that I've been here at the University of Memphis. And I'm originally from Florida, and so I like to tell my students that in all of my classes, I bring in my own, shall we say, flavor of interpretation on criminology and criminal justice as a white Jewish feminist teaching my classes. And so I like to see students, especially those who are passionate about social justice and social reform, and I like to see students who show up in multiple classes of mine, which means that I must not be doing too bad of a job because they tend to stay in touch with me after they leave my classes. So I'm really excited to be here today. And if anybody has questions about my research or my teaching, or in general rants on feminism, which is probably one of my most favorite topics to talk about, feel free to go ahead and ask any questions. So if anybody wants to raise a hand, or you can use the chat box.
Sorry, I've got a, can you hear me?
I can.
Can you guys, I just had a quick question. I assume everyone knows about the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. I was just wondering, what do you think about the nomination, and like, how do you think it's gonna drag out, I guess, or what are your feelings on it?
Oh, I have many a feeling. Well, so I'll backtrack by saying that while a lot of times it's sometimes difficult, especially outside of criminal justice, I like to say that even if you're not a criminal justice major, you probably have some opinions on criminal justice laws, policies, and actions. So obviously the Supreme Court would probably be a most pressing example of that. But the Supreme Court, while it does seem very far removed in terms of its decision-making processes, actually has very much direct impacts on our everyday lives, whether it comes from switching from a Democratic presidency to a Republican presidency and shifting decisions on things like birth control, certainly, which we'll talk about, but also gay marriage, for instance, shifting immigration policies. All of those do have direct implications on our states as well as our local policies, because if something can be overturned in terms of being legally permissible, that also means it can be criminalized, and it means that people can be arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for it. And so the direct implications of having a Republican versus a Democratic Supreme Court cannot be overstated when it comes to our everyday reactions and experiences to policy. So that's a broad rant that I go on to in my classes. But when it comes to a particular topic, like say abortion, one of the most, let's see, broad statements that I can make as a feminist is that, number one, a criminalization, or to begin with, a delegalization or a federal mandate that overturns the constitutional ruling on abortion has direct implications for any biological women, certainly, but even non-biological women, transgender women as well, because it's not just birth control and it's not just abortion, but hormonal policies related to the affordance of transgender populations in terms of being able to receive access to hormonal treatment are also tend to be wrapped up into those policies as well, whether it's from the moral beliefs or as well the legal kind of definitions of how those are imposed. But specifically on abortion, it is, in my opinion, which is what you get, what you pay for, when it comes to my opinion, the overturning of the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade, which is really the abortion ruling in this case, stems from a broad pro-life mentality, right? And unfortunately, that pro-life mentality is not carried over into policies that occur after a child is born, including social services, social welfare policies, and frankly, even in the ways that we handle life when it comes to handling immigration cases, when it comes to incarcerating populations. And so the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, in my opinion, can only really spell trouble for all of us, directly and indirectly, when it comes to protecting not only the right to have an abortion, the right to have birth control, but in all of the other protections of life that come with it, because the pro-life movement, in my biased opinion, is not pro-life, it is pro-birth. All right, there's a few other questions in here. Speaking of gay marriage, it is currently legal, but I read that the right of same-sex marriage may be reformed in terms of being overturned, I'm assuming. How does that work? Will it affect currently same-sex marriage? It's a great question. And what happens when the constitutionality of a prior ruling is overturned does mean that people can be retroactively prosecuted. However, will they? That's always a question. So for example, not in the same kind of vein, but a number of years ago when there were first petitions to be able to decriminalize marijuana, right? And this has been obviously at the federal level, but even amongst individual states, kind of Colorado was probably one of the most famous examples of this. And so there was this discussion that what do we do for the people who've already been convicted of marijuana offenses? When you're coming from illegal to legal, what happens to all those prior convictions? And certainly you could try to vacate convictions, but that doesn't change the years, if not decades, that people have had limited access to jobs, financial relief in terms of social assistance, and then really kind of the social implications that come with having a criminal conviction. So you can do something, but to what extent? In the reverse, when you criminalize something that was previously legalized, yes, there can be an opportunity to either criminalize marriage, no longer recognize it at the very, very least, means that at the federal level, when it comes to filing for things like marriage licenses, but also leaving and recognizing spouses and being able to leave property to a spouse in their will, for example. That can also be challenged. Yes, it's at a federal level, and certainly states are then kind of left up to do their own mandates. But when you have so many states that identify predominantly as red or predominantly as blue, they're going to be making some very different decisions when it comes to how they handle kind of that overturning of the ruling. And certainly our own state of Tennessee is a red state, so it is probably likely that in the case of same-sex marriages and the legality being overturned, our state would probably follow suit in being able to do that as well. So for those who are in same-sex marriages may find that they now have them dissolved and they have to file for civil partnerships, or they may, in an ideal situation, be able to move to a state where it is still legally recognized. But for a lot of people, that's not feasible. Additional question: how have you seen quarantine affect the levels of domestic violence in your research? A+ question, only because that is a very pressing concern right now when it comes to the work that I've been doing predominantly with the social service agencies here in Memphis. So number one, the number of domestic violences in terms of overall cases initially decreased at the start of quarantine. And that might sound like a good thing. However, it ignores the very specific reality that domestic violence, unlike other crimes, has a different context. So not just domestic violence, but all crimes initially decreased at the start of quarantine. And then as quarantine restrictions lifted, and really as we saw the big stay-at-home order lifted in May, we started to see spikes in domestic violence. But that's in terms of reported domestic violence. And that really is why it's so contextually different. Because when you're in quarantine, and a great quote from a social service director that I heard recently was that for some people, being in a stay-at-home situation may be ideal, right? You're an introvert, maybe you're at home with your family, it's a dream situation. But for other people, it can be a nightmare. One, not only because you're enclosed with people 24/7, and that can strain the best of relationships, but it also means that you have even less of a freedom of movement that you may have had before quarantine. So your ability to be able to call law enforcement on your abuser is going to be even more limited, because where are you going to be able to go? Especially for people who are in apartments or either open floor plans, smaller living spaces, there's not really an opportunity to be able to kind of walk away and covertly call the police. And so certainly that lowering of numbers really was kind of a caveat, or a not really reflection of the real circumstances at the beginning of quarantine. But what was also noted was that when cases started getting reported, especially in May, the cases that were getting reported were more likely to be aggravated versus simple assaults than in the past. And so not only does quarantine kind of affect everybody's mood overall. I mean, initially, if it was an ideal situation, eventually, the more contact you have with people, tempers are going to rise. The kind of smallest of things can set anybody off, even in the most ideal of circumstances, and even in situations that don't result in any form of physical, sexual, emotional, psychological violence. But the aggravated assault cases going up meant that one, victims were less likely to be able to avoid the criminal justice system's involvement. Because if you sustain injury and you have to go to a hospital, let's say you don't have insurance. If you have an open criminal case, there conceivably should be no financial charges for you to be able to seek out medical assistance. And so sometimes victims have to kind of get the system involved because they can't pay otherwise, which is not an ideal situation for anybody. But then, additionally, we started to see more aggravated assault cases, and that was kind of a recognition that people's aggression was getting more and more pent up, and the resulting form of violence was more and more serious upon the victim. And that certainly has been something that is consistently ongoing, because if the romantic relationship or familial relationship, it's not just romantic types of DV that exist, but certainly that's kind of what we think of when we think of domestic violence. People aren't leaving those situations, whether it's because they lost their job, hello pandemic, or maybe because they can't afford to move out because hello pandemic. The opportunities that may have initially been available to them are limited. And so the aggravated assault cases going up is kind of a reflection of this kind of overall sense of stress, fear, anxiety that we're all experiencing, but that for some people is resulting in violent outcomes. So unfortunately, it's very much been affected as a result of the pandemic. You guys have had some good questions so far. And I'm leaving the chat open in case anybody needs to be typing any questions, or if you want to kind of turn on your mic or raise your hand. So also too, if anybody has any questions on feminism as a whole, I always like to tell my students that feminism can seem like a scary word when you first think about it, because everybody has very different definitions of what constitutes feminism. So whenever I start my classes and talking about feminism, I talk about my definition of feminism and how we identify it. So just in case anybody has any questions on that. I see a question here. In my feminist political theory class, I certainly want to take that. That sounds awesome. We are discussing intersectionality as it pertains to Kamala Harris's potential to be VP. How do you take this from a feminist perspective? Great question. So in my race and gender class, we talk about the intersectionality theory that was developed by Crenshaw. So kind of Crenshaw is the mother, shall we say, of the intersectionality movement, because she really kind of coined this term, reflecting on the fact that essentially white feminists, including people like me in the past, have not really done our job as feminists because we've kind of taken this blanket mentality that women's rights need to be brought up to men. And so kind of from that feminist mentality, sometimes there's this stereotype that feminists want women to be brought above men instead of equal to men. Just because someone is equal does not make you less equal. And so I feel like sometimes that can kind of be feared. So certainly from a feminist broad perspective, women want to be brought to equivalence to men. But in addition to that, the intersectionality argument talks about the recognition that not all women experience the same lives. And that can kind of seem self-evident, but it's really not. Not least of which because we know that, for example, in the United States, socioeconomic status, wealth, income tend to be in many ways tied to race and ethnicity. Because people of color, the kind of broad term that includes Black, Hispanic, Asian, basically everybody non-white, we know that people of color earn less money. They tend to overall achieve lower levels of educational attainment opportunities. And so the problem with basically the systemic racism of our society is that we, white people, have created this society in which that functions. And for women of color in particular, as Crenshaw argues, they tend to get the most overlooked when it comes to overcoming the racism endemic in our society, because from a racism stance, the kind of big leaders in the field were predominantly Black men. And so they were coming from the mentality as men that the needs and concerns and rights were predominantly from a male point of view. And then feminists like myself historically have been white, and we've come at it coming from a white woman's point of view. And so the Black woman, as well as other women of color, tend to get ignored in that process. And so certainly the intersectionality movement really can be exemplified with Kamala, because I mean, turn on any local, national media channel, and it starts with people mispronouncing her name. And kind of that representation that, is she Black enough, or is she Indian enough? Is she American enough? I like how the initial kind of mentality was, well, is she even an American citizen? Newsflash, yes, she is an American citizen. So, you know, that kind of initial discussion really revealed people's, even women's attitudes and perspectives towards the qualifications of a woman of color being eligible to be VP of the United States. So kind of what I see here is and there's another two questions here about my definition of feminism versus the media's portrayal of feminism affecting views. I think those tie together, actually. So to kind of talk about those as from a uniform response, my definition of feminism, and again, I'm a white woman, so as a white Jewish woman talking about feminism, in many ways, I can be viewed as more or less of an expert because of who I am and what I look like. As a white woman, certainly I kind of fit the kind of textbook definition of what a feminist would look like, outside of the whole stereotypes of the bra burning, long hair, unshaven, whatever stereotypes that have been coming from the past. But also as a white woman, I'm also in some ways kind of given more legitimacy when it comes to talking about feminism in ways that have nothing to do with my qualifications and have everything to do with what I look like. So when it comes to my definition of feminism, that in recent years, probably to be frank, has evolved because of where I am. Coming to Memphis and coming to the state of Tennessee, and certainly recognizing the segregation and disadvantage that really have formed our city, make me very cognizant of who I am coming into a city and talking about issues of racism and feminism and disadvantage and crime, because these are things that I know nothing about in terms of my own personal experiences. And all of my knowledge comes from academic knowledge. So certainly I'm kind of a academic representation of that. But it also means that I have to be using my privilege in more ways than I have typically done in the past. To be able to talk not just as a feminist, but as an intersectional feminist is essentially very, very important as a white woman and as a Jewish woman, because especially for our Black women of color, our Black women feminists, the Jewish populations and Black populations have work together and not work together, depending on the year, really, to be able to fight for equality in different ways for different groups of people. And the media has played a significant role in not just my view of feminism, but in kind of the larger views of feminism. Because when I get in my classes and I say, okay, from my perspective, feminism is this. It is the true equality between not just biological, but identifying men and women of all races and ethnicities. And that is the fact that we have to recognize that not everyone's experiences are going to be the same, and some of that has to do with their background. And it kind of seems scary to talk about that. But when I kind of make it a very blunt statement in my classes, I think students appreciate that, because I'm working from the position that I have, and all I can do is acknowledge my own biases and let you all make the interpretations for yourselves. Because the media has an impact on you guys too, whether it's social media, right? Or it's television media or print media, and the ways in which we advocate for people, where we're talking from a Black Lives Matter perspective, for instance, or we're talking about a broad feminist perspective, for instance. What that means to each group, each person, is going to differ. And certainly all mainstream media, liberal and conservative, are all going to give you their own views of it. So your charge is somewhat difficult in that you have more access to information than my generation ever did. And yet you not only have the ability to access it, but you also have to parcel out what's valid and what's not, especially when it relates to kind of what you feel is true and not true. And that also is a very difficult task to do, whether it relates to feminism or not.
Do you think there should be more laws that deal with social media? For example, like you were talking about how there's misinformation being spread. Do you think there should be more restrictions and limits on how we access the internet and all that sorts?
So that's a great question. Certainly, I think limitations on accessing the internet would probably go down a dangerous path. When we give one group, any group, too much power, it historically has not gone well. And so to be able to kind of control it is certainly kind of a dangerous theme. But I also like to talk about how when, even in cognizant or uncognizant ways, we kind of create ourselves our own echo chambers on social media, particularly, whether it's a platform like Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or Instagram or I know the new one is TikTok, but I don't know anything about it, so I can't tell you. But certainly, kind of we tend to filter out what we don't like, right? And we seek out the things that we do like, and that ends up creating a feed, right? A news feed that reinforces what we want to see. And that's a good thing in some ways, right? Like certainly, we could say, oh, I've got a news feed that's entirely filled with, in my case, corgis, because I really like corgis or cats. And that's great. It's very positive. But it's also kind of a dangerous path because the reality is that there's people who think differently from us. And filtering them out is not going to change anything. And so sometimes people, I think, of your generation get on the internet and they don't know what's legitimate and what's not, especially when it comes to recognizing even sources like Wikipedia can be changed by anyone. And certainly it's been cracked down on in terms of who can make edits recently, but that has not been the case historically. And if that can be changed, what is a legitimate news source? What is a legitimate news site? You can be of one political persuasion or another political persuasion, and both CNN, for example, CNN.com or FoxNews.com are going to be portraying just a very small slice of that reality. So I think kind of the charge to do is to and Google itself is problematic, but if you go to a resource like Google and you search in the same title and you see how many different news sites come up and with the different headlines, learn to take them with a grain of salt, especially because they are trying to tell you a very particular story. It may be a story you agree with, but it's still a story. And there's an old adage that basically said, there's your version, there's my version, and there's the truth. And really, that's news media. It's developed and implemented by people who are just as biased as you and me, and kind of recognizing where people's biases lean, and then taking from that what you will. That's probably the best route to do to be able to be as open and aware and in coming to the conclusions that you want to come to at the end of it, because the restrictions on it. So I told y'all I don't know anything about TikTok, but I do know that we were trying to limit it, right? And kind of using that as a resource. Certainly outlawing anything, especially something that's not universally abhorred. I think that goes down a dangerous path to do. That's my 2 cents on that. All right. How or when have you experienced inequality and how did you overcome it? What are some of the biggest lessons you have learned in regards to feminism? Oh, okay. That's an interesting one. So when it comes to inequality, as a white woman, I have not experienced a lot of it. As a Jewish woman, I have certainly experienced racism in some forms. There is some debate over whether Judaism can be classified as an ethnicity specifically, because as a religion, you were born into it. In the Jewish faith, if you have a Jewish mother and you were born to a Jewish mother, you are automatically considered Jewish unless you convert to another religion. So it is an ethnicity in some ways. Certainly there's a culture tied to the religion as well. Of course, we see this with Islam as kind of another comparable religion. But racism has been limited in my experience also because I don't stereotypically look Jewish. And so the experiences of racism that I have been very, very minor and cannot be compared to people who experience specific racism, particularly in terms of their skin color or their hair. So in terms of that kind of inequality, I can't say that I've experienced much of it. However, the inequality that I have experienced is in many ways tied to feminism. And so I'll give you all some very specific examples since my time as a faculty member. I have been called more often than not Mrs. or Miss in relation to my title than doctor. For the record, I do hold a doctorate in criminology and criminal justice from Florida State University, which is one of the top 5 doctoral programs in the United States when it comes to criminology in any case. So I not only am fully qualified, but I remain fully qualified and I remain highly active in my research agenda as well as my teaching agenda when it comes to being a trained academic. And yet, because of being a woman and because especially as a younger looking woman, despite all my older lady jokes to my students, I often get called Miss or Mrs. because people do not automatically assume that I have a PhD. Or they'll assume that I don't look like a professor because professor is an old white man and I'm neither of those things. So that has in some ways made me viewed as less serious or less qualified of an instructor. And certainly if you've taken me as a professor before, you know I tend to be pretty friendly in my classes. I'm pretty accommodating to most of my students. And so to the point where I see a lot of my students in multiple classes because they tend to follow me from class to class, especially if they perceive me as an easy instructor. And as a result, that has kind of reinforced a perception that I am a professor that can be in some ways taken advantage of. I have students that have tried to kind of con me, whether it's uploading blank documents to eCourseware and claiming that their files got corrupted. Also, for the record, my husband does IT for a living and he can tell that you're lying, so don't do it. And then kind of other things that come with disrespect in the classroom, whether it's students who are on their phone or challenging me in class. I've had students call me vulgar names or attempt to attack me verbally or physically, not here, but at another institution. And so certainly all of those kind of tie into being a young woman in academia. And that's, kind of something to recognize as a unique experience to women in academia. I wouldn't say that it's a disadvantage in the sense of I can get older, but I'm still going to be a white woman. And I will be more respected as I age. I will also be more respected the more I dress up versus the more casual clothes that I might otherwise favor. So all of those kind of go into kind of more of the feminist route than specific disadvantage because I am a white woman. So hopefully that kind of addresses a little bit of both aspects of your question. Jennifer. Hi, Dr. I. In regards to changing the criminal justice system and institutional racism, how would you as a feminist go about advocating for change and then going beyond advocating to actively pursuing change? Excellent question too. I don't think I've actually seen a bad question so far. You guys are kind of really hitting it out of the ballpark. So in terms of institutional racism, one of the things that a lot I see in my classes for my white students is that as white people, we feel like we're kind of in an impossible situation because people don't necessarily feel like they want to apologize for generational racism, especially as y'all's generation gets more and more open and accepting, more than my generation did, or that my generation built upon the generation before me. And yet, by the same token, I see more white students nowadays that are kind of cognizant of the fact that we need to be open about our opinions of racism and its perception in society, because it's certainly not a universal view. So part of that process starts with simply stating our views as plainly and as boldly as possible. And that sounds kind of simplistic, but let me explain a little bit more. So first, your generation, has really been kind of the forefront of the calls for reform and for change that have kind of taken the national landscape, the attention of the country since George Floyd's murder by law enforcement. And it's in some ways kind of tempting to say, well, okay, I'm not out there, so what can I do? In the classroom and out of the classroom, I, as an instructor, have a job to tell my students that we have to be better than those before us and those of us, whether we're actively participating or not. So as a white Jewish feminist, my job is to say that the perceptions that Black people commit more crime are not only incorrect, outdated, racist, and biased, but that to be able to continue to not challenge those beliefs makes you complicit. Okay? If people don't want to say that they're racist, because no one wants to say that they're racist, right? They need to say, okay, well, to borrow Kendi's kind of terminology, how to be an anti-racist. We have to start by challenging in a public spectrum that we are advocating and of the belief that Black Lives Matter. That's where it starts. And so certainly it can't stop there, right? I mean, everybody's kind of pulled up with their social media activism, and that's well and good, but it has to go beyond that, because social media is not where we live. It's not life. So to start, that helps. But to continue means that for those individuals who are going into law enforcement, for example, be a good cop. It sounds simple, but it's not, because you are entering a system where you are going to be mentored by a superior officer who may be from a different generation, and you are going to be working in amongst a group in which you are going to be brought in with a mentality that all cops have to work together, and it's us against the world. And that's a very heady feeling, especially if you've never been in that mentality before, if you've never had a family before, if you've never been in that position of power before. So be a good cop. Be a good cop and make a difference every day. Treat people fairly. If you are not entering the criminal justice system, and I selected law enforcement because I view them as the gatekeepers of criminal justice, but if you are not entering the criminal justice system, or if you are entering another area of the criminal justice system, be fair in how you treat people. I have a son, for example. I have a 2-year-old son. He is a white male. And I am teaching him about racism and differences early on in a way that my generation didn't have the tools to kind of capture, especially white people. So start there and continue in everyday small ways that build up over time. All right, Arrested Justice. Oh, that's a great book. Beth Ritchie is an excellent feminist. So I have not read that particular book, but Beth Ritchie has written a lot of really good intersectional feminism pieces. And so I have not read that book, so I can't specifically talk to it. But I will say that from my knowledge of Beth Ritchie's prior work, that intersectional argument of talking about the Black woman, kind of borrowing on some famous words, but the Black woman tends to be the most forgotten. Certainly Crenshaw kind of built upon that. Beth Ritchie's also part of that group. And Black women have been some of the most targeted as part of the war on drugs and the way in which that we criminalize and sanction for crack and powder cocaine in this country. And that is still very much contributing to the era of mass incarceration that we see today. So I would say that our discussions of feminism and racism cannot be limited to individual slices, but have to be taken as part of an overall whole from her work. What are your thoughts on the ERA and the backlash that is still behind it? Ah, great question. So perhaps a lot of people don't know, but there is no federal act of equal rights in the United States to talk about equal rights between men and women, biological or gender identifying. So the fact that we do not have a simple act that can be passed around and across, rather, political lines speaks to pretty much the equal state of our country. That act has been brought up a number of times over the past decades, and it still remains an active act. It has not been passed. So have we come as far as we'd like to think we have? Well, some of us have thoughts that we have come further than we really have. Others of us say that we have a lot more work to be done. I'm of that mentality. Certainly, every year I tell my students, you are entering a field that you have a lot to overcome. I've been teaching now almost 9 years, and I still have that same message that I've had since I started. So are we as really far as we have thought we have come? I don't think so. What are your thoughts on the backlash of challenging people who hold racist ideals and practice? Ooh, well, that's a tough one. So it depends on the person that you're encountering, right? Certainly when encountering people in public who you don't know, there's been a lot of use of social media to kind of highlight racist actions, right? There was a kind of wave over the last year where people were calling the police on, going from that stereotype of the Karen who's calling the police when she or he sees Black people particularly, but other people of color doing things, everyday actions, non-illegal actions, just everyday actions like selling water bottles or being in a park or sleeping on a bench or breathing. And kind of having the police used as kind of their tool to action. So in public, kind of challenging those people can be difficult, if not dangerous. And that's why people film, because the reality is that you may be attacked physically for your challenging. So I would always say, be careful. But it's probably more difficult and yet safer. I don't like using that. That's kind of a not quite right term, but if it's amongst family members, that can be more difficult because we know these people. We love these people in many cases. Family doesn't always mean love, but a lot of times it does. And so to be able to kind of challenge people that we know, love, and respect is very difficult. And so sometimes it means sharing links to news articles, assuming they'll read them. Sometimes it means setting a limit for yourself. Am I going to call them out? How am I going to call them out? Am I going to call them out for being actively racist? Am I going to call them out for holding racist ideals? Am I going to hold them for making racist statements? So that can also be a specific challenge. So adding on to that question, what if it's between a police officer and their supervisor? I'm not going to lie, I'm not a cop. So it's easy for me to make recommendations, right? I mean, I sit in a classroom, or in this particular case, I'm sitting in my office. So for me to be able to say that you need to challenge a legacy or a system can be a little idealistic in some ways. But it can also mean that the actions that an individual officer can take might be minute. It may be that officers need to band together. Certainly, the last time I taught the race and gender class here in our department, I have my students watch a documentary. It was on Hulu, but it's actually on YouTube now, called Crime and Punishment, where there were 12 NYPD officers, people of color, who were held to higher quotas and tickets that they had to issue, arrest citations, because they were viewed as being softer on people of color as potential suspects. And they sued and they won. So I'm not going to say that it's easy, because they had to sue to get their jobs protected. So I hesitate to kind of say that this is the way it needs to be. Ultimately, I would say, as a police officer, you can do within your purview what you can do. And if you can do it, do it. If you can't, try to make changes in other ways of your life. That's all I can kind of say. Systemic racism, specifically in the justice system, is such a deeply rooted problem that many people in positions of power refuse to acknowledge it. Very true. What specific actions do you believe we need to be fighting in order to see real change or reform? Well, some we're already seeing, and that's kind of the good news, right? There's been this call to either abolish or defund the police, depending on your perspective. There's certainly been calls for reform, and there's also been kind of the new wave of politicians that are coming in that are young. I mean, most politicians are old white men and are from a different generation. So can we be surprised? There's this kind of new wave of calls for reform that are becoming more systemic in being heard, which is wonderful. So I think that helps, but it's going to be needing to be continued, especially if, we don't see a shift in power in the Oval Office, for instance. That wave needs to be carried on. So some people believe systemic racism doesn't even exist. How do you successfully convince people it does? Well, the short answer is I don't, because the reality is that every semester I teach, I always give my students opinion papers at the end to say, write what you want. And I grade based on grammar and length, and I don't judge based on content unless they are making claims that need to be backed up with websites or other references, right? And so every semester I go into my classes and I say, okay, there's three facts of crime that people tend to recognize. Men commit more crime than women, particularly violent crime, although as a whole, property crime tends to be more common than violent crime. So men commit more crime than women. Typically that refers to biological men, but that's kind of a changing definition. Young people tend to commit more crime than old people. It tends to be kind of a young person's game, roughly between the late teenage years and early adulthood years, so 15 to 25, 14 to 24. That kind of age range shifts from year to year, but it tends to be that 10-year range. But then it comes to race, and every semester I always tell my students, no matter what you believe, Black people do not commit more crime. And you might think that if you turn on your news, and I say turn on because, of course, I use my television for news versus my phone. But here's the thing. As a researcher, I have access to a lot more information than the everyday American does when it comes to understanding patterns of crime. So most people turn on the news, they see a Black person being arrested, and they say, okay, well, must mean Black people commit more crime. And nothing can be further than the truth, because when we actually talk to people who have either reported or not reported experiencing crime or committing crime, especially the crimes that went unreported, they paint a very different picture of crime. In fact, they say young people tend to commit more crime and young males tend to commit more crime, but there are no racial differences in the people who commit crime. So whether or not you believe systemic racism is a thing, why do police data suggest that there is an overrepresentation of particularly African American, but people of color generally, African American men in the criminal justice system? And then you talk to people who've experienced crime or perpetrated crime, and there's no race differences in who commits crime. What's the deal? Well, the deal is that most people don't have access to the surveys that researchers like myself, professors, have across the country. And so they turn on the news, and that's the only way that they get information about crime. And so thus, they have, in many ways, blinders put on them to what they understand about crime, because that's the information they have access to. So really, it's the media, kind of spoiler alert, who's giving you this idea of crime. So I start every semester by kind of referencing those 3 facts, and I end the semester with those 3 facts. And yet these opinion papers that I give to my students inevitably will say, some of them, not all of them, Black people commit more crime. So the short answer is I can't change people's perspective. I can only give you the information that I have access to that you might not, and see if you change your mind. Because if you do, well, that's great. But if you don't, I've done my job. I'm giving you information that you don't otherwise have access to, but I can't change your opinion, and I can't change what you do on a daily basis. I can only hope that you can. So it's not a very satisfying job sometimes, honestly. You mentioned being referred to as Mrs. Yes, rather than Doctor specifically. How have you overcome this? Honestly, I repeat it. So if a student emails me and says Miss Iratzoqui or Mrs. Iratzoqui, I write back and I say, it's Dr. Iratzoqui. And students may roll their eyes, but I did not go to college for 12 years to be referred to as Mrs. Also, Mrs. Iratzoqui is incorrect because that's my mother. My married name is not Iratzoqui. So I also believe that if you're asking me for a favor as a professor, you should probably get my name right. The other component of it is that if you don't know what to refer to a professor as, and so some students don't, a lot of times, especially kind of being here in the South, I'll automatically get referred to as Mrs. or Miss in my daily life. So I know it's, a reflection of that as well. The universal term to use for any professor is professor. A person coming to teach your class every semester is going to be a professor, whether that person has a master's degree, a Ph.D, life experience, or some other kind of qualification. So professor is always a good thing. But for students who repeatedly call me Mrs. after I tell them to call me doctor, well, you don't want an angry professor grading your grades. So I typically just repeat over and over again in my emails or in my lectures. All right. You all have had some great questions. Does anybody have, I think you're scheduled for 1 hour. So is there a final question that anyone wants to answer? Or if you'd like me to rant about feminism for 1 short minute, I'm happy to do that. All right, so the last thing that I'll leave you all with is, first of all, thank you very much for all your questions, especially for so many of you who aren't criminal justice students, but for those criminal justice students, I see you guys, and it's great to see you guys. But the issues that we face as a society and that I talk about in my criminal justice classes are certainly not criminal justice specific. Any individual should be concerned about systemic racism, for instance, and issues of feminism as well, because that's our society. And whether or not you're a criminal justice major, you're still exposed to our society. It's also not limited to American society, but most of my discussions will center on Americans specifically. You all have done the first charge by going to college, and especially in a pandemic, that difficulty cannot be understated. You all are rock stars for continuing on and continuing your education in the wake of something that none of us could, well, maybe some of us could predict it, but not all of us could have predicted. So thank you for being here, and thank you all for continuing on. Thank you all for being Memphis Tigers, because I'm biased, but I think we're pretty cool here at the University of Memphis. And if you can, please take a class with me. I'll be here, knock on wood, for many more years, because I currently just went up for tenure, and barring any significant barriers, I should be here a long, long time. So hopefully you all are not graduating this semester. And if you can, please stop by and say hi when we're all safe and ready to do so. So nice to meet everybody, and hope to see you all in face-to-face classes sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much.